Imagine, if you will, that you are living in the 1980s. Reagan is in the White House. Big hair is a real thing in the 80s, that's for sure. And many feel like it's a little simpler time. In Virginia, there is a beautiful 23-mile stretch of road. It's still there. It connects Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown. And it is called Colonial Parkway, gorgeous Virginia land. And as kids are prone to do, they find somewhere to hook up. They find somewhere to go so they can be in love. Young couples pulling off into secluded scenic overlooks. This is something that happens along this Colonial Parkway, looking for privacy, a quiet moment, a stolen kiss. Instead, what four young couples found was an unspeakable nightmare. This isn't just one story. This is a series of chilling, believed to be connected disappearances and murders that have haunted this Tidewater region for decades. Today, we're going to peel back the layers to remember the victims and lay out the stark, terrifying facts of this enduring cold case driven by lust. The sin, lust. The definition of the English word lust in both Hebrew and Greek is to deeply desire something or someone that is not yours. And it can be sexual, but also non-sexual. In this case, the clues indicate it was a sexual lust. This is the why behind the crime, the motive. I'm Ashley Wilcott. I'm a TV anchor, a former judge, and a trial attorney. And I would say that almost every single case I've ever touched has a component of one of the 7 deadly sins: pride, greed, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, and sloth, the opposite of 7 heavenly virtues, temptations that, taken too far, turn deadly. This week, we break down the disturbing cold case of the Colonial Parkway murders and how the deadly sin of lust resulted in the murder of 4 innocent couples, as well as newly discovered DNA evidence in this case. A little later, I am joined by Monika Torres, host of the podcast Crime Fuse. She is a former CBS and Fox producer. And in our breakdown segment, we will go deep on the how and the why lustful desires caused a serial killer to target young couples. Let's get into it. This is the Deadly 7. Our story begins in October of 1986 in beautiful Virginia. The air is crisp. The leaves are changing colors. Kathy Thomas is a 27-year-old. She went to the Naval Academy. She was a promising stockbroker, and she was spending time with her girlfriend, Rebecca Dowski. She had also attended the Naval Academy, and they were described as bright, full of life, and in love. Until they went missing. A white Honda Civic, the car that they'd been in, was found at an overlook on Colonial Parkway. Inside was a scene of horror. The car had been pushed off an embankment. When it was found, Rebecca, her body was found in the back seat. Kathy's body was in the hatchback of this Honda Civic. The killer had then attempted to burn the car. Both women were found like this. They were bound with rope. Rope burns were found on their necks and their wrists. Both of these victims had been strangled. And on top of that, their throats were slit so deeply that each of them was nearly decapitated. This wasn't just murder. This was personal, brutal, and had a disturbing sexual component that would become a sinister thread, possible thread, throughout all these cases. Now, fast forward almost 1 year later. Now we're in September of 1987. And there were 2 individuals that were together. It's David Knobling, 20 years old, with Robin Edwards, who was only 14. Here's what we know about this is Knobling had taken Edwards out with his little brother. So Knobling's 14, the 20-year-old gives the 14-year-old and his own little brother a ride. They take him out, they do things, and then he dropped Robin Edwards, 14-year-old, off at her home. What we know is later that night, she snuck out to meet up with Knobling. That's the last time they were seen. On September 20th of 1987, Knobling's truck was found abandoned by the James River Bridge. Yes, of course, this is on Colonial Parkway. The keys were still in the ignition, the driver's door was open, and the windshield wipers were still going. There were no bodies inside this car. 3 days later, both of the bodies washed up onto the beach at Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge. The type of weapon used in these murders was different. They were shot. Each of them had been shot. The way that family knew something had happened to these two individuals, by all accounts, Knobling's truck was his prized possession. So as soon as it was found abandoned, they knew something horrible had happened. And they were right. Now, only 6 months later, shorter and shorter times between these murders, there was a whole new layer of terror. Cassandra Haley, 18 years old, and Richard Call, 20 years old, went on a date to see a movie. After the movie, they went to a party. And after the party, they were never seen again. Again, a car was found. Richard Call had a beloved Toyota Celica, and it was discovered at a York River overlook. This was just a few miles from where the first two victims had been murdered 2 years prior. There were several pieces of clothing found in the vehicle, as well as the car keys. And dogs traced the scents to the river, but then lost any scent. Unlike the previous two cases, Cassandra and Richard have never been found. No closure, continuing in an agonizing wait for the family. A short 5 months later, in September of 1989, two more victims. Anna Maria Phelps, an 18-year-old, and Daniel Lauer, 21, were together. They were not romantically involved. They knew each other because Anna Maria was dating Lauer's younger brother, and she actually lived with him in Virginia Beach. They were struggling financially as a young couple, so 21-year-old Daniel Lauer said, "Hey, I'll move in with you all and pay rent so I can help you out financially." And Lauer needed to go back home to get his belongings. And so Anna Maria said, "Hey, I'm going to ride with you and see my family while you're there." They go, they see their family, but on their way back to Virginia, specifically Virginia Beach, to start their new lives, they vanished, disappeared. Nobody heard from them. On September 5th, again, what was found? Their car, abandoned at an I-64 rest stop. Now, interestingly, a little strange detail is this rest stop was on the opposite route that they would have gone to get back to Virginia Beach. But nonetheless, the car was found. Their bodies were found months later, murdered, wrapped in a blanket in the woods. The bodies were so decomposed, investigators were unable to determine their cause of death. Jennifer Phelps, Anna Maria's sister-in-law, told Richmond.com, "I feel like for my husband and my sister-in-law's case, and for their sake, well, really for the whole family, we just want to know what happened." So what do these 8 cases have in common other than the location along that 23-mile stretch of Colonial Parkway? There were 4 separate incidents, 8 victims. All of the victims were between 18 and 27 years old. They were all targeted in or near isolated scenic overlooks. The couples were clearly the target of these vicious attacks and murders. Despite extensive investigations by local law enforcement and the FBI, no arrests have ever been made. Sexual assault and DNA evidence. DNA evidence was recovered from some of the scenes, offering a glimmer of hope. And in fact, that glimmer of hope did provide information about what might have happened to some of the victims. Not all of the murders have been entirely solved. It's still treated as a cold case. But in 2024, there was an advance in the case because of DNA technology and DNA from some of the murders. A significant development regarding one suspect, Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. Here's what we know about Alan Wade Wilmer. In January of 2024, the Virginia State Police announced that through the DNA evidence found at the murders, as well as DNA from Alan Wade Wilmer Sr., that he was identified as the killer of David Knobling and Robin Edwards. Those were the two found in September of 1987. But Alan Wade died in 2017. He was no longer around to face justice. There was no other evidence to connect him to the other murders, but there were some similarities in the cases that couldn't be ignored. Who was this guy? He was a fisherman. He drove a Dodge Fargo pickup truck. He'd been seen around. He had his clamming tools in the back of his pickup truck. And a little tiny fact that's interesting about him. There were two authors, Blaine Pardo and Victoria Hester, and they wrote a book called A Special Kind of Evil about the Colonial Parkway serial killings. And they actually wrote in their book that this man in 1988 was a suspect in those two deaths. But he allegedly passed a polygraph exam and was cleared as a suspect. We know he had no criminal record, but he has been identified as the killer of those two victims. There's also a new announcement in June of 2024 that DNA evidence from the murders has also been linked to a serial rapist, Walter Leo Jackson. This now suggests perhaps multiple perpetrators of these crimes. But when we get into it, some of the details that caused me to say lust was at the heart of all of these murders. Joining me now is a former producer at Fox, CBS Local News, and podcast host of Crime Fuse, Monika Torres. Monika, thank you so much for being on with me today. You and I have spent time on your podcast talking about current crimes, trials, P. Diddy, and others.
Yep.
And I really am grateful to have you on to talk about the Colonial Parkway Murders. 8 different individuals, 2 together each time, so 4 different incidents. And they're unsolved, although DNA has connected one person who's since died to 2 of the murders. It's really unsolved and considered serial killings. And so no one's ever been charged. The nature of the crimes in different regards strongly points to sexual motivation and lust. So I want to turn to that. But first, I just want to get your general thoughts when you hear sets of 2 people over a course of 3 to 4 years, all murdered. What do you think?
So I personally, as a true crime junkie, I feel like this was definitely a sexually motivated crime. I cannot tell if the victims were random, but I'm under the impression that they are. I would say that some of these victims, they were ambushed in the cloak of the night, and that to me really strikes as the perpetrator specifically as somebody who is using nighttime to try to attack victims and just kind
Mm.
of ambush them. So that was my first takeaway from it.
Yeah, that's an important one, and there was a lot of struggling in the first instance, and they were bound by ropes, and it was, um, strangled, and a knife was used to slit their throats. But then we know 2 of the other victims were shot and murdered by gun, and so I think when we look at this, some people may say there's no way it was one killer, it had to be all different killers because of the different ways that they killed them, but there are some things in common. So let's add to the facts that we know that there were reports that the victims were either nude or partially nude, and the bodies, that haven't been found, some of their clothing was found in the abandoned vehicle. And the other thing the FBI points to are the brutal nature of the deaths. So add those facts to now what you've just said, which is, ooh, under the cloak of night and darkness, and these people are ambushed, but then they're missing clothes, partially nude, and brutal murders, regardless of how they were murdered.
Mhm. I would say that I'm under the impression that he didn't know the victims, and he was really using nighttime to further attack them. I definitely feel like he was sexually motivated. So I would say that he's just he I think he was personally trying to throw off the police and law enforcement in general, by using different, weapons. I think it was one person and not several, even though certain reporting is saying that, it's kind of open to interpretation.
Ooh, I like that theory. And I know that the fact that you mentioned the isolated at night scenic areas, really, according to many and those who are investigating, say it does suggest a predatory nature and a desire for control and sexual domination. The FBI has categorized types of crimes and behaviors as indicative of sexual homicide to include things like the burning of bodies, the hidden locations of body, and what you just said, Monica, which is to conceal the full extent of the crimes and the fact they burned the first car. Other bodies were wrapped up and then they were found, but their bodies were so decomposed that they can't even say what the cause of death was.
Mhm. Yeah, I would say that the decomposition of the bodies, and the location to me is really telling. I think it he was really just kind of hiding out, waiting for the next person that was really, sitting in their car, making out, what have you. That's kind of how I interpreted it, and I thought this guy is really out to attack not a specific person, not specifically, Cassandra or Richard, but specifically he's I think he's different from like a Brian Koberger, but in some elements he's the same. So I think he's not necessarily targeting um, one particular person specifically, and it's more about the atmosphere, who happens to be coming along, driving by, making out, and then he kinda strikes. He's like, "Oh, let
Yeah,
me
the
do this."
I didn't mean to interrupt you, but you're right, the vulnerable victims, because, okay, so the 2 girlfriends, Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski, were girlfriends. They were in a romantic relationship. But then you also have victims, Daniel Lauer and Anna Maria Phelps, who were not at all romantically involved. They were traveling together, they were in the same vehicle, but that was it. But the thing that they do have in common is the fact that, for instance, Kathy and Rebecca were found, nude or partially nude. And then Daniel and Anna Maria were found hidden in the woods nearby a month later, but they were partially clothed as well. And so I don't think it mattered to whoever killed them who the victims were. They could have cared less. They just had their sexual predatory nature about them. And as soon as they found 2 people in a car, they went to work, so to speak.
Yeah, I definitely agree. The only part that throws me off a bit is the fact of the weapon that was used, in one of the instances, the knife. That to me was really telling because he doesn't know the victims, but he chose a knife to kill these particular victims, some of them, not all. So from previous reporting, it has been stated that using a knife is a very intimate object. Typically, it's performed by somebody um, who specifically is who knows the victims, who dated them, who's friends with them. He has some connection to them, but in this particular story, it doesn't appear like he really knew the victims. It was just random weapons, random attacks. So it's very interesting what I guess motivated him. And I guess for me, my follow up question would be I wonder what his childhood and upbringing was like. Was he successful with women in general? Was he a reject? Was he an incel? Um, so that is something that till this day is a question I have.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And let's talk about, too, in this case, that there's an element of what's the right word that I want to use here? There's an it's not just stalking. It's not just you wonder, was this person driving up and down Colonial Parkway every single night until he found someone to target? Or was it a desire, a sexual desire that would hit out of the blue? And because it did, it went from 1 year to 6 months to 5 months in between the killings, which we know from a lot of literature and statistics is true of serial killers, that the time between each killing becomes less and less because they're less and less satisfied, so they go after the next thrill. But I cannot but wonder if this is someone that was driving up and down, waiting every single night, or rather just would sit on that impulse until they couldn't control it anymore, and then it didn't matter who they found. Two people in a car stopped, they were going to do this.
The first instinct I have is I wonder where the killer lived. If he lived just like a block away or if he lived 100 miles away. Because if he happened to live a block away, it's very easy for him to just be kind of lingering in that area. Maybe he's jogging, comes across people. He awkwardly has his car parked somewhere. So that's the first, I guess, question I would have is where does this guy live? Is he in close proximity, like, for example, Brian Koberger to the victims, where even though he was in Washington, the victims were in Idaho, is only a quick, like, 15-minute drive. So that makes it a lot more easy to spend your time lingering in that area. Whereas if he lives 100 miles away, 300 miles away, um, it's a lot harder and it makes you wonder how random was this really?
And you mentioned Brian Koberger. I want to circle back to something you said about Brian Koberger. We know murdered the 4 University of Idaho students using a knife. But police, even after his sentencing hearing, he pled guilty to all 4 murders. He's been sentenced to life in prison without parole for each of the murders. And earlier this week, right after the sentencing, law enforcement said this was not a targeted crime. He did not target these 4 individuals, but yet he used a knife. And I would agree with you that typically a knife is thought to be a very personal way to kill someone. But in that instance, he didn't personally know them, have a relationship with them, according to law enforcement. Just like in this instance, we don't know that the person who did it had a personal relationship. In fact, it would suggest that they didn't, but yet used a knife.
Yeah, I think that some of these serial killers, they're smart in really evil ways, and I think sometimes because that fact is so well known, they use it to their advantage. Specifically with Brian Koberger, I mean, he was a criminology student. I'm sure in his teachings at some point or another, they had let him know, okay, this particular weapon is typically used with people who know the victims. So he probably, if he wants to commit the crime, he's thinking, okay, let me to throw off law enforcement, let me use a knife to make it look like maybe it's the boyfriend, Jack Decor or whatever. So it's possible that in this case, that was his mindset too, is he was trying to outsmarten police. And this particular killer, he probably, in my opinion, I think he had something similar with Koberger where he was trying to outsmarten police and he maybe thought he was just really sneaky and smart by using different weapons, and just being very random. With
And serial killers can be very smart. In fact, in Brian Koberger's case, we know now that documents have been released, an inmate said he's the smartest person he has ever met in jail, referring to Brian Koberger. I have to mention something else, though. The Gilgo Beach killer, this is an accused serial killer in Long Island. And here's what really bothered me. They have connected him, the defendant, presumed innocent, but going to be standing trial for multiple murders where
Mhm,
bodies were found in Long Island on Gilgo Beach. But the weird thing is, they have found other bodies and body parts, Monica, that they say absolutely have nothing to do with this alleged serial killer. And in fact, some people have said, oh, it's kind of a dumping ground for bodies. A what? And so the other part of this, I think, is the Colonial Parkway a place where people know if we want to go find people that are isolated in the dark of the night and want to commit a crime against them, hey, let me go to this 23 stretch of highway in beautiful Virginia because that's the
mhm.
place to go to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, parkways and certain, like I-90, I-5, those I feel like are probably in a killer's mind, the desired areas for them to dump bodies, also bodies of water, lakes.
Mm,
So it's easy to just mask the bodies within that area because it's so large.
yeah. Okay, as a true crime junkie, I have to end with this. How do you deal with the fact that there's no identified killer? Now, the law enforcement is saying that there's a connection through DNA technology in 2024, and they do believe that the now deceased identified person is the responsible for two of the deaths. And I'm looking again for his name so I don't misstate it. But
Mhm.
absent that, no charges, no arrests, still remain cold cases. What do these families do with that? Because if it were me, I'd think it's impossible not to know who did this. Somebody has to know. Somebody did this. Why can't we figure out who did this? And I need to know specifically what happened. Why my children? Why my family? Why my relatives? And what do you say or how do you think about the families of these victims?
Well, for starters, it's devastating for the families not getting that closure that they're always so desperately seeking. I think it's a lifetime of, reminiscing and thinking, who could have done it? Was it my neighbor? Was it my ex-boyfriend? Was it my uncle? Who knows, right? So, for starters, I feel really bad for them. Obviously, that's traumatic in so many ways. All of us seek closure, specifically in these situations, rightfully so. Um, but I think, what they need to focus on, I'm hoping is if I were in their shoes, I would want to hire my own private investigator, a private detective to really go through the facts now that it is a colder case and see if there was any uh not necessarily mistakes, but there was something that was overlooked that they can go back to and say, "Okay, maybe we can go back to these stomping grounds and see if there is another potential killer, connected to this crime." So that's how I would think about it if I were them. Obviously, and luckily, I'm not in their shoes, um, but it's just a devastating, situation for everybody involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And the FBI did identify as the killer of David Knobling and Robin Edwards, Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. Of course, he died in 2017. But the FBI has issued a public appeal for anyone who may have known or encountered this fisherman Wilmer when they were hunting, fishing, or at bars in the 1980s to come forward with information because they are actively working to reconstruct his movements and encounters. They are trying to solve these cold crimes. If you know anything that's happened, please contact the FBI. Monika Torres, thank you so much for your great insight today. And
Good.
everyone
Thank
listen
you so
to her
much.
podcast, Crime Fuse,
I appreciate it. Thanks so much for having me.
anytime.